It was nearly midnight in Hillside General Hospital, a modest but overworked facility nestled in the heart of Wellington, Ohio. The fluorescent lights flickered faintly above the nurse's station, casting a pale glow on the stacks of patient charts and empty coffee cups. Nurse Alina Monroe, 29, adjusted the knot in her curly bun and exhaled into the quiet of her shift. Alina had been working doubles again. It wasn't by choice, but life, as always, didn't ask for permission. Her mother's dialysis bills were piling up, her student loans never stopped barking at her heels, and rent in her modest apartment across town had gone up by $50. $50 to a woman like Alina could be groceries for a week. She didn't complain. She couldn't afford to. Alina had always believed that kindness was a currency of its own. She didn't have money, but she gave in other ways. By staying late with patients, comforting scared children, or sitting with the elderly when no family came to visit. So when the ER doors opened with a gust of cold winter wind and a man stumbled in with nothing but a threadbare jacket and bloodied hands, Alina didn't hesitate. "Sir, sit down. You're hurt," she said, rushing over. The man was ragged, his coat frayed at the seams, his boots more duct tape than leather. His beard was thick, untrimmed, and his eyes were tired, but not just the kind of tired from lack of sleep. He wore the weight of the world behind them. "I'm fine," he mumbled. "Don't waste your time on me." Alina ignored him and gently led him to a chair. "You're bleeding. Let me help you." The man looked like he hadn't felt a gentle touch in years. He stiffened, then let her guide him. "Name?" she asked, wrapping his hand in gauze. He hesitated. "Chris." "Last name?" He didn't answer. Alina tilted her head. "You don't have to tell me, but I'm still going to help." Chris gave her a strange look, like she had spoken in a language he'd forgotten. One of warmth. After patching him up, Alina brought him a cup of coffee from the vending machine. It wasn't gourmet, but it was hot. "You're not from around here," she said, sitting across from him in the quiet waiting room. Chris shrugged. "You could say that." "What happened to your hand?" "Glass," he muttered. "I tried sleeping in an old bus shelter. Guess someone didn't like that." Alina's eyes softened. "I'm sorry." "Why?" he said. "It's not your fault. I'm just sorry that it happened to you." Chris looked at her, truly looked. No one had apologized to him in years. Not for what he'd become. Chris returned a few more times over the next week, once for a sprained ankle, another time to get his blood pressure checked. Each time Alina was there. He noticed how she smiled through exhaustion, how she brought extra sandwiches to share during her breaks. Sometimes she'd pretend she wasn't hungry so he'd have an excuse to take one. "I'm not a charity case," he said once, trying to give it back. "You're not," she replied, pushing the sandwich toward him. "You're a person. That's enough for me." But Chris was a mystery. He never talked about his past, never mentioned family. Alina respected that. In her heart, she felt drawn to him, but she didn't know why. One night, as snow began to fall outside the hospital windows, Alina found him sitting outside the ER entrance. Just sitting, staring up at the flakes. She brought him a blanket. "You'll freeze out here," she said. "I've been colder," he replied without looking at her. "Why do you keep coming back, Chris?" "I don't know," he said. "Maybe this is the only place where I don't feel invisible." What Alina didn't know was that Chris wasn't really homeless, at least not in the traditional sense. His full name was Christopher Hayes, CEO of Hayes Tech, a multi-million-dollar tech company in New York City. 3 months ago, he had walked away from it all. After a board betrayal, a scandal he didn't cause, and a media circus that painted him as the villain, he disappeared. He wanted to know what it was like to be no one, to be unseen, and perhaps to be judged not by money, but by soul. What he didn't expect was to meet someone like Alina, someone who gave without expecting, someone who looked at him, really looked, and didn't see a project or a burden or a lost cause. She saw a man with bleeding hands and offered him help. A week later, Chris didn't show up, nor the next day, or the next. Alina found herself worrying. She even checked the shelters and asked around the ER. Days turned into 2 weeks. Then one cold Thursday evening, just as she was finishing her shift, she found a note taped to her locker. It was written in clean handwriting. "Thank you, Alina. You reminded me that there's still goodness in this world. I can't stay, but I won't forget you. No signature. Just that. She read it 3 times, her heart tightening with each pass. And then, she did something she hadn't done in years. She cried. Spring arrived with cherry blossoms and open windows. Hillside General had quieted, and Alina had stopped looking toward the entrance every time the door chimed. Until one evening, a black luxury car pulled up to the curb. A man in a crisp, tailored suit stepped out. He had a neatly trimmed beard, short hair, and walked with confidence. Alina almost didn't recognize him until he spoke. Miss Monroe, she turned. The voice was deeper but familiar. Her eyes widened. Chris? He smiled gently. Actually, it's Christopher. Her lips parted in disbelief. He took a step forward. There's a lot I didn't tell you, but everything you knew about me, that was real. She blinked. You're not homeless? I was lost, but you helped me find my way. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small box. And now, I want to ask you something. The first snow of the season had come early that year. Alina wrapped her scarf tighter as she stepped out of the hospital's side entrance after a 14-hour shift. The wind bit at her skin like tiny glass shards, but the cold wasn't what made her stop in her tracks. There, on the weathered wooden bench by the ambulance bay, sat a man. His coat was thin, torn in places, and his jeans were soaked from the snow. His face was partially hidden by an old beanie and a thick beard, but his eyes, clear, sad, and startlingly intelligent, watched the snow fall in silence. Alina slowed as she approached, torn between moving on or helping. Are you all right? She asked gently. He blinked, startled by the kindness in her voice. I'm fine, he replied quickly, but his shiver betrayed the lie. You're freezing, she said, frowning. How long have you been out here? The man hesitated. Since last night. Alina looked around. No shelters open at this hour. No cabs would take someone like him. She bit her lip, considering something she rarely did, getting involved outside her shift. Wait here, she said, disappearing inside. 10 minutes later, she returned with a large hospital blanket, a steaming cup of black coffee from the break room, and a turkey sandwich she'd bought earlier but never eaten. Take these, she said, placing them beside him. The man looked up at her with a mixture of disbelief and something else. Respect. Why are you doing this? Alina offered a tired smile. Because it's cold, and you look like you haven't had a warm meal in days. He reached out, his fingers trembling slightly as he took the cup. What's your name? Alina. Alina Monroe. I'm David. A pause. David King. Alina brought him inside. It was a quiet part of the hospital, a small empty family waiting room with outdated magazines and a buzzing soda machine. She brought him a blanket from the supply closet and a cup of coffee from the vending machine, even though she knew she couldn't spare the change. He took it with both hands, the warmth almost shocking to his fingers. She finally asked his name. Daniel, he said simply. Just Daniel. No last name. No story. But Alina didn't push. Something in his silence felt sacred, like forcing words out of him would break him in a way he couldn't recover from. All right, Daniel, she said, pulling up a chair beside him. You're safe here tonight. He looked at her like he'd never heard those words before. Over the next week, Alina saw Daniel often. She brought him socks, food from her lunch, and once, when he was caught in a cold rain, she gave him her umbrella without thinking twice. Most people avoided him in the hospital lobby or crossed the street when they saw him outside, but not Alina. To her, he wasn't a nuisance. He was human, and without her realizing it, Daniel, whose clothes were ragged and voice barely above a whisper, was quietly watching her with eyes that had seen the world from penthouses and private jets, and found something priceless in the compassion of a nurse who had nothing to give but her heart. It had been 2 weeks since Alina last saw Daniel. She searched the bench every morning, before and after her shifts, sometimes walking the block around the hospital with a flashlight, asking around. But it was like he'd vanished into the snow, leaving behind only the ghost of his quiet gratitude. She didn't even know his full name. Nurses noticed her change. She laughed less, worked harder, spoke softer. When asked, she only smiled and said she was just tired, but a part of her, the part she didn't speak of, ached with absence. Daniel had become something unexpected in her life. Not a patient, not a burden, but a calm in her storm. She had given him warmth, food, and kindness, but somehow she felt like he'd given her more. 3 months passed. Spring rolled into town with blooming dogwoods and buzzing bees. Alina had nearly convinced herself she'd imagined it all, that Daniel had been a flicker of goodness in a hard winter, a brief kindness between strangers. Then one Monday afternoon, everything changed. She was charting patient notes when a voice spoke softly behind her. "Miss Monroe?" She turned. There he stood, clean-shaven, dressed in a tailored charcoal suit, polished shoes catching the sunlight from the window. His hair was neatly combed back, and the same deep, intelligent eyes met hers. But this was no longer a man sleeping on benches. "Daniel?" she whispered, confused, her heart racing. He smiled. "Not exactly." The hospital had just finished renovations when Alina saw him again. She was walking through the lobby, clutching a patient's chart and barely registering the soft piano music playing from the new speakers. Then the elevator dinged, and everything stopped. Daniel. But this wasn't the Daniel she had last seen shivering under a street lamp. His beard was trimmed, hair cut neat, dressed in a tailored charcoal suit that whispered wealth with quiet confidence. But those eyes, still clear, still kind, found her instantly. She froze. Her heart forgot its rhythm. "Alina," he said, walking toward her. "Hi." She blinked, the words caught in her throat. "You? What happened to you?" He smiled gently. "I think the better question is what you did to me." He took her to lunch at a quiet rooftop restaurant later that week. He told her everything. His real name was Daniel Whitmore, heir to the Whitmore Global Trust, a reclusive tech empire. He had vanished from the public eye after a personal tragedy, the death of his mother, the only person who'd loved him without agenda. Everyone else saw his money. He needed to know who he was without it, so he walked away from it all. No credit cards, no press, no privilege. For 6 months, he lived among the forgotten. Until the night he met Alina. "You were the first person who saw me," he said, voice quiet. "No strings, no judgment, just grace." Tears welled in her eyes. He reached across the table, took her hand gently in his. "Alina, I've been around the world, worn every mask money could buy, but I've never felt seen like I did when I was nothing. And you loved me anyway." She shook her head. "I didn't love you. You did. Maybe not in words, but in action. In the way you sat with me when you were exhausted. In the food you brought when you couldn't afford to spare it." He stood up then, drawing from his coat pocket a small velvet box. "I don't expect a yes right now," he said softly, kneeling in front of her. "But I came back to ask if you'd give me a chance to earn a forever with you." Her hands trembled as she covered her mouth. A quiet restaurant, a wealthy man kneeling, a nurse with tired eyes and a tender heart, and a ring that sparkled, but not nearly as brightly as her tears when she whispered, "Yes."